Hello and welcome to this training event for the BTEC Tech Award in Art and Design Practice. Getting started, ways to teach and assess. My name is Simon Fox and I'll be the trainer for this session. The objectives for this session are to look at the qualification purpose and structure, so give an overview of how the qualification works in your centre, including internal and external assessment, looking at the assessment availability and different delivery models for the programme, look at how grading is worked out, and to offer additional support that's available to you. This event is ideally for people who are new to the qualification, and it gives a general broad overview. There are additional events specifically looking at the internal assessment of Component 1 and the external assessment of Component 2 in more detail. First of all, let's look at the qualification structure. As you can see, there are two components to the art design. What you may find with other colleagues in other sectors is that they might have three components. Historically, there are three components in Tech Awards, but what we found with the previous qualification specification was that components 1 and 2 tended to be merged together in centres, and we also started to encourage that activity. So with the 2022 specification, we decided to combine components 1 and 2, so all of the internally assessed elements are in one larger component, component 1, creative practice in art and design, and the externally assessed component is responding to a brief, component 2. And you can see how much of each of the course they take up. So component 1 is 60% of the weighting in the qualification, and you're expected to spend approximately 72 guided learning hours on that. So that's timetable sessions delivering component 1. Component 2 is slightly smaller with 48 guided learning hours, and the weighting is that it takes up 40% of the qualification in terms of the overall grade. Component 1 is internally assessed, so that means that you assess it and apply marks internally within your own centre using a Pearson Set Assignment that's issued by Pearson. There are 4 tasks and it's externally moderated, so a moderator will visit your centre and have a look at a sample of your assessment decisions to make sure that you're assessing accurately. The assessment takes approximately 20 hours of supervised sessions, so we're looking to timetable 20 hours over a number of weeks to undertake the internal assessment of component 1. So that's the time learners will spend actually producing the evidence for the assessment. And the papers are released every September for the Pearson Set Assignment for component 1, and May, June is the moderation period when final marks are submitted and the moderator is involved. Component 2 is externally assessed, and this is a synoptic task, which means it's run at the end of the qualification. Again, it's 20 hours of more closely supervised supervision. So these are sessions where learners are getting on with a practical project, a practical task, but is more closely supervised and there's more tighter controls over the activities undertaken. And the end result of component 2 is sent off to Pearson to be examined by a team of examiners. And again, the release for that is early in January, and assessment is scheduled for May, June each year. These components are interrelated and best seen as part of an integrated whole rather than distinct study areas. Both of the projects involve responding to a brief in a creative way, and both of them involve going through the full creative process or design cycle from initial idea to a theme to generating a creative outcome. So let's begin by looking at internal assessment, which is component 1. This is assessed via a Pearson Set Assignment. So it's based on a vocational scenario. It's broken down into tasks that the student completes in order to take developing evidence, which will then be assessed. And it's the same skills assessed through each assignment, so only the context changes. So each time a Pearson Set Assignment is released for each series, you'll be familiar with it because the tasks and the skills and the general format of it will be very much the same. The only thing that changes each year is a vocational context and theme. But this must be used to assess the internally assessed components to meet the new performance criteria table. So although you're teaching it and assessing it internally, the Pearson Set Assignment is the assignment you would use to actually judge and make a record of achievement against the marks in the mark grid. So we use mark grids to assess these, which offers a consistent structure across all the internal components on the qualification as it moves forward. And it's fully compensatory within each component and within the qualification, which means that learners build up marks through each of the bands of the mark grid. That's all added up, and then they receive an overall grade at the awarding stage from Pearson for each component. And those marks also contribute to a final qualification grade. And the compensation means that a learner achieving well in one area can use that to compensate for perhaps less good achievement in other areas. So the Pearson Set Assignment for Component 1 consists of an activity and a set of tasks with a theme and a context. So it gives a component overview and the teaching content. It relates to the learning outcomes for the component. So in the specification, you've got learning outcomes and essential teaching content, all of which you will spend in the teaching and learning stages preparing learners to produce creative responses to a theme. And then the Pearson Set Assignment allows learners to apply that knowledge and skill that they've built up during the teaching and learning period to apply it to a particular theme and a particular vocational context. It has suggested timings and marks for each task and explains the assessment controls and conditions that need to be followed during the actual assessment itself and managing the assessment in terms of your supervision and timetabling and application of resources. So the document contains all of the assignment and information the learner will receive, and you will submit that to your moderator with marked learner work. You can download Pearson Set Assignments at any time from the Pearson website. They're released every September, so the June 2026 assessment is already available, and it's the one that we're going to look at now. Okay, here we have the Pearson Set Assignment for June 2026. So this was released in September 2025, and at the time of recording this event, learners are currently working on this one, and they have approximately 20 hours. We say approximate because the component 1 is internally assessed, so it's dealt with just like an ordinary BTEC assignment that you would set and assess yourself. The only difference is that Pearson has provided the assessment itself, and that will provide a different assessment each series. So let's go through the different pages. Because it's internally assessed, the instructions go directly to the learner. So this is effectively the assignment you would hand out to them. So the instructions are directed to the learner, and it explains to them how they should go through the assignment and what the activities and tasks consist of. So it explains how the instructions are divided into 4 tasks and gives an idea of how the 20 supervised hours will be spread out. So 3 hours to complete task 1, 6 for task 2, 8 for task 3, and 3 for task 4. We'll explain how these work in more detail in a second. But it notices that the time is for guidance only, and it's just an indication of how long to spend on each task. So when you're administering the assessment for component 1, there is some flexibility here, but there's an assumption that it would need around 20 hours to complete the whole assignment. It provides instructions for learners that they must work independently and they shouldn't share their work with others. It needs to make sure that we are asking learners to give an independent, authentic response to the theme. So it's really important that they produce their work independently. It's not in exam conditions, but it is important that supervision is there to make sure that learners are working independently and any external sources they use are clearly cited or referenced. It notes that the learner can ask teachers for support if they've got questions about the requirements of the tasks, what evidence they need to produce, and any resources they need to access, but clearly states that you can't give learners feedback on how to improve their work or guide them to specific solutions to any questions or problems in the tasks. It goes on to list the resources, including an art and design studio or working space. Obviously, students need work and space to work and produce their artifacts. The range and art and design materials is relevant to the program being delivered. So it's important within the set assignment that learners are responsible for selecting and deciding what materials will be relevant for their theme and how they're going to approach it. So it's important that you provide them with a range of art and design materials that are relevant to the specialism or the program that you're working with, so they can make that decision and then make that choice. Of course, appropriate safety equipment also needs to be available, and storage facilities for keeping work safe between sessions. Because although it's not an exam, as it's something of a timed assessment, in between sessions, then work does need to be taken in and stored securely and then given back out at the next session. Learners will need access to a library or internet resources because there is an element of external research and assessment. They're looking into artists and designers and practitioners. They're looking into the theme and the context. So they will be able to access internet and library resources during the course of the investigation stage. And they also need to record their work. So many workers will be working on physical attributes. So they'll need to think about capturing that with photography, cameras, or scanning or printing. So again, access to those and training on how to use those materials and resources is also going to be important before the assessment starts. So this page is the one that changes in each series, and this is the vocational context. So for example, in this one, which is the June 2026, the theme is consumerism. And so the vocational context gives an overview of the theme, gives some historical and social context to it, also starts to begin to discuss different aspects of the theme. So in this case, we're looking at consumerism. We're looking at a definition of consumerism about the act of purchasing and the joy of owning something new, a bit of a historical background about the idea of people being consumers taking shape in the early 20th century, and then going on to talk about a particular recent phenomenon, Black Friday. Now, it recognizes that this originated in America, but also the fact that it's now in the UK. That fact in itself is quite useful in terms of introducing ideas of globalization, for example, that, something that happened in America based on a very specific American holiday, Thanksgiving, has now found itself across the Western world in terms of globalization because it's an opportunity for brands and markets to work across the world. It talks about marketing strategies like fear of missing out and limited time offers and savings. But of course, not everybody is in agreement with the concept of consumerism. So it's important that we give learners the opportunity to explore alternative approaches or critical appraisals of it. So mentions things like Buy Nothing Day, which is a distinct reaction to Black Friday. So it's bringing up these ideas and these concepts for learners to explore. So one of the first things that they would do in their research is think about the idea of consumerism, think about how they could respond to it creatively, look at artists and designers and practitioners who've explored areas of consumerism or produced products or items for sale. Think about how they might be able to use their materials, techniques, processes, their formal requirements and different ways of approaching the theme and exploring that in a practical way as well. So thinking about how they can apply visual communication and looking at how other people have done it. One thing you'll see at the bottom of the sheet is a blue box, and this is, as a center, although everybody is going to use the same overall theme and use the same text in the vocational context, you are able to adapt the vocational context and add to it if you're working particularly in a specialist area. So if you're working in fashion and textiles, for example, or product design, you might want to actually put an additional requirement in there and contextualize the theme a bit more. So you may ask students to work on a particular marketing campaign or a particular brand, or you may be asking them to work towards a fashion show, or it may be fine art work towards an exhibition. So you can add an extra vocational context in there to make it more meaningful and more realistic for your learners, but you can't change the actual theme itself. And now we go on to the tasks. So first task is investigation. So it's about a thorough investigation into the theme of consumerism. And the results of this research will inform all of the work for the project. Now, that's a very important point, that what we're looking for is that learners' initial research informs what they do afterwards. What we find with a lot of lower performing learners is that they undertake research into artists and designers that don't really bear much relation to the theme. And the work that they do at this stage then doesn't really go on to inform their practical projects and their ideas. They don't join the dots in that way. Higher performing learners often see that the research and investigation and initial experimentation can be really purposeful and can be really strategically used to help inform what they do subsequently. It goes on to explain what the investigation should include. So it's research into the work of artists and designers related to the theme. We're not looking at biographical details here. We're looking about the formal elements. We're looking at the properties they use, the way in which they've approached it, but also how they've responded to the specific theme of this paper. It must include primary and secondary research. So again, this is an assessable outcome. So there needs to be an element of primary observation, work direct from primary sources, as well as secondary research. And research is also practical. So it's exploration, practical responses to the work of the practitioners they're looking at, but also trying ideas out, exploring materials and processes. And also crucially, annotation reflecting on the research in progress. So writing about not just what they're doing, but why they're doing it, the reasoning behind it, justification of creative decisions, evaluation of how this research is going to help inform. So this evidence could be in a range of different ways, but what we're suggesting is sketchbooks, worksheets, or blogs, as long as it includes those four elements: the research into artists and designers, primary and secondary research, initial practical responses, and reflection. The format can be whatever you like. Now, remember, this is internally assessed, and we've arranged that the moderator will come and visit you, so the work doesn't have to be sent off anywhere. So the format and the medium can be very flexible in terms of component one, because you keep it in the center as long as you've got adequate secure storage and the moderator can access it when they come to sample. That's absolutely fine. So looking about 3 hours for task one to actually start developing that initial research. And this feeds into the ideas generation. So having done that initial investigation, they're now developing ideas. So standard ways of doing this is mind mapping, mood boards, visual methods, brainstorming, experimentation further. The key thing is that learners need to record that. They need to record how they're generating their ideas. They can't just simply magic an idea out of thin air and tell you that that's what they're going to do. You need to see how they got there. So if they are exploring alternative ideas or different approaches, then a record of that is really useful as well. And again, as suggested evidence, this isn't a prescriptive list. It could be anything like the evidence here, or you may have a different format, different approaches. That's absolutely fine. But we're looking at about 6 hours for task two to generate and develop ideas ready to the point where they can start producing a final outcome. And task three brings us onto that. So this is development and creation of the final outcomes. So they're building on the experimentation, they're building on the initial investigation, they're continuing to test out and explore a range of materials and processes. But in this case, they're looking at the ideas and progress so far. So it's a good chance for learners to actually take a step back and stop for a minute and say, look objectively at what they've done and think, okay, is this going in the right direction? Is there anything else I need to look at? Selecting and applying the specialist practical skills and producing the final outcomes. So it's not just about barreling on ahead and getting on with the final outcome. It's about really giving it some thought and considering what needs refining, how they can develop their skills to make the outcome as good as it could possibly be. Maybe reflecting on the time left and the feasibility of what their initial ideas were, and coming up with a plan for how to complete the assignment successfully. But again, the records of the development and refinement of the ideas is crucial. It's not enough to simply produce the final outcome and present that. We need to see how they got there. So tests and photographs, screenshots, wireframes, toiles, as well as the final outcome, and annotations on the work are very useful, sort of reflective commentary on how it's going and justifying the decisions made as they go along. And they've got 8 hours on this roughly, so plenty of time to actually develop a final outcome and keep refining it and making it as good as possible before they complete. And once they've produced that final outcome, then there is actually a further task, which is about presenting the evidence. So this is about learners putting together a portfolio of evidence that shows the whole journey from initial investigation all the way through to producing the final outcome. So what we're looking for here is a cohesive, coherent portfolio of work that really shows you that journey and the decisions made along the way. So really, it's very important that learners understand the skills and the ideas involved in photographing their work, presenting their work in the best possible light, playing to the strengths of the work and showing the shape, the form, the textures, the visual communication, the clarity in terms of annotations and the narrative that they provide in terms of the generation of ideas and developing their ideas. So it's really important that learners give this sufficient thought and consider the presentation to be the end result and the creative putting together of everything they've done so that they can get as much credit for the work that they did as possible. And we're looking at about 3 hours for completing that. Now, the format of this can be anything you like because, as I said, it's internal. It's not going to get sent off anywhere. However, it might be a useful opportunity to get learners to develop, for example, digital portfolio building skills, digital presentation skills. For component two, as we'll see, component two is externally assessed, so that is sent off and they do need to prepare a digital portfolio. So you might feel that actually it's quite a useful practice run to do that again with component one and get them to produce a digital portfolio, even though it's not a mandatory requirement for this one. But it's something to think about how students can develop those skills in portfolio presentation. But as you can see, it's quite flexible. There's quite a lot of interesting ideas that you can bring to the quite a lot of flexibility for learners to come up with their own individual responses. Okay, I'll go back to the slides. So as we mentioned, component one is marked by you in your center using a mark grid. And we'll look at the mark grid in a minute, but basically it's a very simple 12 marks per grid, 3 marks in each mark band. It's a simple structure that follows all the way through. So it provides a consistent approach to making best fit decisions. It's compensatory so that learners take forward all marks gained towards the overall qualification outcome. So every mark that they build up on component one will contribute to the final grade. It's important to note, though, at this stage, you're providing raw marks, so you're providing individual numerical marks. You're not allocating pass, merit, or distinction grades. All of the pass, merit, and distinction grades of the actual qualification are done at the end in the awarding process, and that's done by Pearson. So there's nothing that you need to worry about in terms of how the marks actually align with grades at this stage. But it is important that you get a rank order of learners established. So effectively what we mean here is that you'll have a learner that gets the most marks in the group, and you'll have a learner that gets the least marks in the group. And then every learner in between gets something in between. So you have an order of achievement in terms of the whole group. So let's look quickly at the mark grid. This is also published on the BTEC website on the specification page, so it's freely available and you can look at this and share it with all of your staff, and it's really useful to actually discuss this with the learners as well. There's nothing hidden in a BTEC, it's all transparent and open, so it's really useful for the learners to understand how you're going to be assessing it. So there's no reason at all why you can't discuss the mark grid specifically with your learners. So looking at the document, it's got some introduction about how it works, but I'll slip straight to the actual grid itself. So what you have, as I said, is a simple 3 marks per mark band, and there's 4 mark bands, and this follows all the way through the entire component. And the mark bands are defined by these descriptors. So mark band 1, where you get 1 to 3 marks. We're talking about evidence that is basic, limited, superficial, or tentative. And mark band 2, we're looking at whether it's a bit better, it's adequate, it's sufficient, it's got some or partial coverage, or it's straightforward. Into mark band 3 for higher performing learners, you're talking about evidence that shows competency, that's appropriate and is most clear. And then in mark band 4, we're saying that the evidence shows confident application. We're talking about effective processes, thorough evidence, and in-depth understanding. So in each case, we're making a value judgment on the evidence that you're presented with. So the idea of this best fit approach is that you have the evidence in front of you that you're marking. You look at the evidence and you look at the statements in the mark grid and decide which statement best fits in terms of a description of what you're looking at. And once you decide which statement is the best fit, then that will give you an indication of how many marks to allocate. So if you have an example of evidence that maybe spreads across 2 mark bands, this is why we have 3 marks within each band. So you can say, okay, this work is clearly competent and there's a clear understanding and it's firmly in mark band 3. So I'll give it 8 marks. It's smack bang in the middle of mark band 3. However, if the application of some of the work was confident, or you felt that some of the practical responses showed a bit more of an in-depth understanding, you might decide that it's, although it's not quite fully in mark band 4, you could give it more points. So you could maybe give it 9 marks in mark band 3, or maybe it just tips over into 10 marks for mark band 4. So again, there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of how you mark it. So each element, you've got 12 marks you can give. So what we have is that the grid is then reflecting the actual learning outcome. So learning outcome A has these 2 sets of statements, 2 sets of marks. And we're looking at the first one about application of investigation methods. So how did they apply investigation into looking at primary and secondary sources? And then the second element to that is practical responses to the work of others. So their initial investigation in terms of academic or contextual research, but also how did they then respond practically to the artists or designers they looked at? So how did they use that to inform what they produced? How did they use that as contextual understanding about, well, how have others approached this and how will I approach it? And how have they used visual communication? The second part is about the use of then practical experimentation. So it's really important that learners understand that we want to see them experimenting. We want to see them trying new things, trying different things, being bold with their testing and experimentation, but learning from it and using it as a means to develop their work and develop their ideas further. So again, the use of practical experimentation, showing an understanding of how materials, techniques, and processes can be used to communicate. So trying things out and seeing if it works in terms of conveying a message. And when we get on to learning outcome B, which is about generating, communicating the art and design ideas. So this is about the recording and communication of ideas that is informed by the investigation. So again, you'll see that we're really reiterating that the investigation and the ideas generation need to have links, and showing an exploration of a range of creative opportunities in relation to the brief. So it's taking the initial experimentation and investigation and developing and generating an idea with a direct relation to the brief and responding to how that works. And again, we're looking at a mix of limited and basic through to adequate and sufficient through to competent and appropriate, all the way up to confident, effective, thorough, and in-depth. So you're making, there are no extra tasks, there are no extra activities. What you're doing is making a value judgment about the quality of the evidence. Learning outcome C, now we're looking at the actual practical development. So there's quite a few marks to be had here. The first part is about the selection of materials, techniques, and processes and how relevant they are to the intentions. So how relevant they are in terms of the idea and what they intend to produce. So again, this is why it's important that as teachers, you provide adequate access to a range of resources because the students are being judged on their selection. The next element is about practical skill. in applying and manipulating techniques and materials and processes. So this is about, how good they are in executing the final piece. So have they refined it? Have they manipulated materials well? Can they draw? This is about the actual quality of the piece itself and the development work. And then finally, for learning outcome C, you've got the application and development of review processes, leading to refinement of work and achievement of the intention. So did they actually achieve what they set out to do, and how did they get there? So the key thing here is that there's 12 marks to be had on the quality of the actual critical reflection and the review of work, and how they used that to objectively plan how to improve and refine the work and improve it so that their final outcome is as good as it can be within the timescale. So thinking about how it responds to the brief, reflecting back and saying, well, am I still on track? Am I still actually answering the narrative and the theme? Have I got any elements that could be refined or improved? Have I got time to tweak it and polish it up a bit more? So all of those things that where a learner is actually recording that process. Again, it's all about the recording of the process. And then learning outcome D finally is about presentation. So this is about what they actually submit for evidence. So remember, a learner doesn't have to hand in everything they've done. A lot of this is about selecting and editing the most appropriate evidence, but presenting it in a coherent, logical way that tells the story of how they got from the initial idea all the way through to the final piece. So the coherency of the presentation, how much they've considered how they're communicating the strengths and qualities of their work. So again, 12 marks to be had there. So when it comes to actually applying the Pearson Set Assignment, you have the Pearson Set Assignment document itself, and then you use the mark grid to assess the work at the end of that. There's an assessment record sheet you can use, which is also available on the website, and that's a way of recording those marks. But those are the two documents that you need to make those decisions. What we're going to look at now is exemplar standardization materials. So these are marked examples of learner work. So what we do is we collect year on year after each series examples of real learner work and that have responded to one of the papers in a series, and we look at the marks that they achieved, and we provide examples of that and a moderator's commentary to justify and explain why they achieved the marks they did. So they're very, very useful. And we have a range of materials. So there's learners who've got really high marks, learners who've got rather low marks, learners are somewhere in the middle. And each series they'll be developed and built up so that you can build up a bank of these materials, which are really useful. But the intention for this is not only that it shows you how the marking can be applied, but it's really useful for standardization. So if you have more than one teacher involved in assessing in your school, then it's really useful to spend time in a staff meeting or development time to look at these exemplar standardization materials, look at the standards being applied and make sure that everybody understands this is how we would expect the mark grid to be applied in this particular case. So they're really useful because they're real learners who've really achieved proper outcomes. They're on the subject qualification page as well, and they're freely available, so you can get them anytime. There's no longer any need for you to use platforms such as Oscar, and you don't need to register a lead internal verifier. Basically, whoever's leading the program can just access these and look at them at any point. It's recommended you save them and build up a library, especially if you get new staff coming on board. It's really good for induction and really helps explain how the assessment will work. However, we would suggest that you don't show them to learners particularly, even though they're quite useful because they do show how a learner responded. It's important to note that there's a million ways in which a learner can respond to a particular theme, and this is just one example. The risk if you show that to learners and say, look at this learner who got 70 marks, isn't it a good piece of work? That your learners might say, well, I'll just copy that then. I'll just follow how they did it. And in fact, that's not very helpful because what we're really looking for is an individual personalized response that's authentic to your learners. So to avoid any learners thinking they can merely copy it, which of course they can't because the context changes every year, or if they can copy the approach. We want learners to think about it themselves, and part of the assessment, as you've seen, is about how they can justify and record their own responses. So this is for standardization for you. So for the purposes of this event, I've chosen a learner who's getting a middling mark, so somewhere in the middle. There are high-performing learners, there are low-performing learners, and there are plenty of different materials, so you can download all of these off the website, but I'll look at one that's somewhere in between. So what you have in this document is the introduction. You have the Pearson Set Assignment that this learner sat, and then their work. Then you get the marks that they achieved and a justification and a summary as to why. So this particular Pearson Set Assignment was on the theme of narrative. Now, I don't need to go into a lot of detail just to explain that this is the one that they responded to. But it's exactly the same process as we've just looked through with the current paper. So this learner started looking at animals. So remember, the theme was narrative. They decided they were going to look at animals, and their initial artist study was Angela Harding. So they're looking at Angela Harding, who's a very established printmaker, works in woodcuts primarily, and does natural scenes with a sort of mid-century style. And this learner's looked at that, discussed the materials, found some secondary photo, but actually done some primary observation work as well, looking at different materials, breaking up the colors, different approaches to line. Developing this further, they're looking at Elise Gravel, who's a cartoonist and children's illustrator, and thinking about how to then apply those kind of styles to their own work as well. So you can see this learner's really jumped straight in with looking at different artists, looking at different approaches, and to an extent, applying that kind of approach to the work. At this stage, they're not thinking about narrative necessarily. They're not thinking about the actual response to the context. Now they're looking at experimenting with different materials. So you've got some sgraffito, you've got some different coloring techniques, different line making techniques. Not necessarily messing around with composition yet, but just looking at the different effects of materials. And he went to a talk by an author. So Tamsin Winter did a seminar for the students, which is quite nice. That kind of thing's really good. And thinking about how narrative works. So this is now the learner starting to investigate contextually the actual theme, looking at narrative, looking at how authors develop a story and how they work in the different aspects of people, place, protagonists, antagonists, for example. Moving on to more material exploration. So now you've got some primary imagery of the learner's pet, and they're looking at the dog and they're using that to develop some oil pastel drawings, thinking about the different colors, thinking about how that works. There's some evaluative elements there, talking about how they could have improved. And again, more material exploration, trying to break it up and make the image more abstract, trying to use different approaches, introducing some digital work as well. So they're using Photoshop for color fillers. And again, thinking about how successful or how effective it is. Relatively basic evaluation at this stage, but again, useful to see what level of discussion is going on. They also did a project that was involved during the course of the assessment, which is looking at helping and mentoring younger learners. So the year 10 learners went off to look at reception, and year 1 and 2 learners and work with them on the Michael Rosen book, We're Going on a Bear Hunt, which is really good application because this learner is particularly interested in animal development and developing images of animals and stuff. But also in terms of narrative, you're looking at children's stories. So the two things all start coming together in this project, and you can see how they've worked together with that. Now we're looking at developing the idea of narrative and how could you work with those primary images and develop them further, and what will they actually come out with? So they're thinking about a product, or are they thinking about a piece of art? Again, they've got a photograph that they took themselves and they developed that into a lino print, thinking about how they can make a final image. Another one as well, similar kind of technique, using an initial image, looking at printmakers as interesting, and then working that into a lino cut image. And these were the final outcomes they produced. So there's the image of the pig and the owl in a couple of different ways where they've taken the lino cut, they've done some digital manipulation and tried a few things out. Not massively well executed, not particularly well developed, but as we said, this is a learner who's somewhere in the middle on the whole mark band scheme. What they have done is thought about how they could develop that into a product. So they're looking at ideas for t-shirts, bags, and mug prints, so they could take that image and develop it. And finally, they've got an evaluation. So it was a bit light on annotation throughout, which is something that we would recommend that they put a bit more evaluative evaluation directly within the portfolio itself. But they finish with an evaluation, which is a series of bullets. And again, it is evaluative in terms of they've talked about why they think it meets the theme, what they did, and how it worked. But it's not particularly sophisticated or in depth. Okay, so as we said, this learner was somewhere in the middle. So they got 49 points, 49 marks in total. The principal moderator said it's an adequate body of work which sufficiently addresses all of the learning aims. The portfolio documents all stages of the design development and provides an appropriate but predictable approach to responding to the theme narrative. So there's a number of strengths here, but there's also a number of areas that could have been developed much further. So the learner got 6 marks for the first grid. So they're just at the top of mark band 2. And so that it's sufficient investigation, it's been adequately applied. It is dipping into mark band 3 because a lot of the stuff that they chose was quite relevant, and there is an element of relevant primary and secondary sources in terms of what they're producing, but not enough to bring the whole thing up into mark band 3. But again, it's an important point here. The learners attempted to produce work in the style of the practitioners they've researched, but not all of these demonstrate a real understanding of how they communicate visually. So it's quite superficial in terms of their response, but you can see how that's then informed their work. So again, not bad, but not exactly setting the world alight. On grid number 2, you can see that it's slightly stronger. They've got 7 marks. So we're saying that actually the experimentation with a wide range of materials, techniques, and processes. So they've got drawing, painting, printmaking, and digital, and photography. They're quite variable, but they understand some awareness of how they can be used to communicate. So although they weren't particularly effective, there's definitely a level of competence there about in terms of trying out different things. And moving on to learning outcome B, again, 7. So just above halfway, we're saying it's competent generation of ideas. The key thing that it's not always clear how it responds to the word of narrative. So the theme was never really strongly suggested apart from when they researched into illustrating stories. And it was never really explained that that was what the learner was doing. They just went straight to drawing animals and didn't really go beyond that. So although the idea kind of works, it was never very well justified. But there's a sufficient range of creative opportunities, and the ideas were informed by the earlier investigation. That's certainly a link there. In terms of learning outcome C, again, 7 marks. The learners selected an appropriate range of materials, techniques, and processes to use. They are partially informed by experimentation, and they're mostly relevant to the creative intentions. So again, it's pretty straightforwardly down the middle. It could have been a lot more strategic, could have been a lot more effective, could have been a lot more pertinent to what they wanted to do. And as I say, throughout, they could have justified what they're doing in terms of narrative much more clearly. They got slightly better on grid 5, so we're talking about skill. There was quite a good show of skill in terms of some of the practical skills. So the lino prints work quite well. The superimposition of the illustration of the L onto a range of products, that's quite a nice touch actually. And the way they did that was quite effective, and it worked quite well as mock-ups for t-shirt and mug and plan designs. remembering the level that we're talking about here. So, we would expect much more from a student at level 3 or above, but at this stage, that's not bad, not bad development of the ideas. Grid 6, not quite so strong. So again, the development of processes. So although it's quite repetitive and there is some development and there is some sufficient refinement from the initial exploration, but so they have kind of abstracted the images a bit more, but it really could have been developed further. There was so much more possibility, and I think you find with a lot of learners that quite often the initial ideas are quite strong or they're quite promising and they don't necessarily follow it up in the final outcomes. Now, whether that's a time management thing, whether it's a confidence thing, it really depends on the learner, but it's something that should be encouraged to say, to try and take this as far as you can within the time allowed. So there is annotation throughout the portfolio and it's adequate, but it's quite descriptive. So a lot of the time the learner's telling you what they did rather than telling you why they did it or what they think of it. So again, not quite so strong. But the actual record of skills development and communicating that was much better. Overall, the portfolio is pretty coherent. It does demonstrate what they did and considered how to communicate the strengths of their work. There's some quite nice presentation of images alongside each other, so you can see a strategic development in a particular image. It's a logical order. It shows the intentions. So again, it's middle of mark band 3. So with these exemplar standardization materials, they often end in some tips. So based on what we've been looking at, here's some tips for what we're really looking for from learners. So for learning AMA, learners should make sure the portfolio includes evidence of all the activities undertaken during the project. So in this example, learners made reference to an initial visit to collect visual sources and additional practitioners, although it doesn't really provide any further evidence of these activities. So it mentions they did it, and you see a photograph of a duck and a dog and a pig. It doesn't really talk about what they did and the work that they put in. And I think the key thing here is getting learners to understand that the evidence is their way of getting credit for the work they put in. So while they don't need to overload you with loads and loads of extraneous information, it's important that they do fully explain or justify the activities they did for the purposes of the assignment. And for learning AMC, learners should use the period of development to allow their ideas to evolve. It should include exploring how materials, techniques, and processes could be manipulated and combined to produce creative or unexpected results. So I think in this case, the learner's development kind of stopped short. They they started with an idea of doing some images of animals. They did some images of animals. They didn't really take that further. In terms of the narrative theme, it's still very unclear how that relates back to narrative. The animals that they did were devoid of context. They weren't in an environment. They weren't in relation to anything else or even each other. So again, it was difficult to actually see, how does this work with narrative? Have you remembered that that was the plan? So again, that's something that this particular learner could have done considerably better and picked up quite a few marks. Okay, back to the slides then. So that was a learner who received a sort of middling mark, a medium mark. As I said, we've got learners who got considerably higher marks in exemplar standardization materials and other learners who were scraping sort of band 1, band 2 achievement. So it's well worth looking at all of them and seeing the comparison and seeing how different portfolios look and how they accrue marks. Now, because this is internal assessment, there is the opportunity, as with all BTECs, for a resubmission and potentially a retake. So this is a standard rule for all vocational qualifications based on regulatory requirements. And it just means that effectively, because this is internal assessment, if you feel is necessary and if you feel it's helpful, learners may be authorized one resubmission. So after marking the work, so the learners have submitted the work by the deadline, you've marked it and you've worked out how many marks they're going to get. If you feel that they've not really achieved their expected potential and you feel that they could benefit from resubmitting improved work without further additional support, then you may authorize a resubmission. So what you would do is you'd give them a new deadline, give them a short amount of time to address any shortfalls in their submission, and you would then remark it. The feedback, therefore, is very important. And again, this is a general rule for all BTEC qualifications. General feedback can be given to the learner on which areas they need to work on. So you will give them the marks that they've achieved, and you can provide in your feedback a justification of why they achieved the marks they did and why they missed out on marks that they didn't quite make. However, remember always that this is individual learners' work, so you can't give them specific instructions or make decisions for them on what they specifically have to do to improve. So you talk in general terms about what they did well, what they didn't do so well. Based on that feedback, based on the marks that they got, and based on the assignment that told them what to do in the first place, they should be able to work out how they can tweak or amend the existing evidence to make it better. So if you do that, you need to make sure that you've given them a specific deadline, and you've left yourself time to then remark the work to address any issues and come to a final decision on the marks. Because what happens once the marks are submitted to the moderator, then no further resubmissions can be allowed, because obviously once you've submitted your marks to the moderator, those are the final marks, and that then goes on the system. And so once they're done, that's what the moderator will be using as the basis of their judgment. Once the moderator process is started, then resubmissions are now off the table. In very rare circumstances, you may feel that a learner, after having gone through the whole process, been marked, done final marks, it's been resubmitted, you've given the final marks to the moderator, it's been moderated, and then they've got the results, you feel that the learner really didn't achieve what they are capable of, then there is technically the provision for a retake. However, the thing you've got to remember with a retake is that it needs to be a completely new piece of work based on a completely new series. So effectively, you're waiting to the next year for the learner to retake the whole Pearson Set assignment on the new topic, on the new context. What we recognize is for art and design that that's probably for most centres it's not feasible, because most centres will be taking component one in the final year, and so therefore the learners will have finished the course and will have left. So doing a retake isn't really possible. It's not something we'd recommend anyway. It's purely there as a safety net for a student who, for whatever reason, really messes up, and you feel it's worth retaking. But it's a lot of work for everybody, not least the learner. So it's something to be aware of as a final sort of safety net, but it's not something that we would recommend you're relying on or even suggesting that you do. So while there is technically the opportunity to enter the students for component one in their first year, see how they get on, and then enter them again in year two and do a retake and try and improve, I think first of all, you've got to think about the workload, not only on the learner, but on the staff, but also whether it's fair on the learner to set them up and make them do an assessment in the first year when you could have spent all that year teaching and preparing them and getting them better, so that when they finally do the assessment, they're as well prepared as they can be. So again, it's something we would seek to avoid in terms of over assessment and creating too much pressure on the learners. What we recommend is that you spend the start of the program really focusing on the teaching and learning. You use the past papers as mocks, as practice runs, as different projects that you can use formatively and just informally to get an idea of where the learners are, using it as formative assessment, so that when they come to do the actual summative assessment for component one, they know what the papers look like, they know what the activities involve, they're used to the idea of producing this work in response to a brief, so they're more comfortable with it, and that they are a bit more relaxed and will be confident and prepared to actually submit. So I think preparation is the key. Okay, we've talked about moderation, so explain how that actually works. So for component one, as we've said, once you've done all your internal marking, and if you've had any resubmissions, you've done that, you then submit your marks to Edexcel Online. So your exams officer has full access to edXL Online, which is the platform we use to submit grades and marks. Those marks are submitted and a sample is selected by Pearson. Now it's a random sample, but you should note that it will include the highest and lowest marks achieved. So the learner getting the highest marks in your group will be sampled. The learner getting the lowest marks will be sampled to ensure that we've got the full range, but then there'll be a random sample between those highest and lowest marks. And this will be confirmed before the moderator visits. So you give us plenty of time to submit the marks so we know that there's marks there needs to be selecting a sample. Pearson selects the sample and should give you sufficient time before the moderator visit to make sure that you've got the samples required ready and prepared and the moderator can come in and see them. You also need to make sure that there's not only the learner work, but the assessment record sheet for each learner, which incorporates also a declaration of authenticity. So the moderator can see the work that the learner did and the marks that you gave it and the feedback you gave to the learner. So the process goes like this. Once the moderator is allocated, which will be after you've entered the learners for a particular series, they'll contact your quality nominee. So every BTEC centre across the world has a single point of contact called a quality nominee. And that's usually the person who's responsible for quality assurance in your centre. So it may be a deputy head, assistant principal, or it may be a particular designated quality manager. So they're the person we get in contact with, so they can pass it on to the relevant program leader to negotiate then when moderation will take place. So you negotiate a date with the moderator and make sure that everybody understands what the process is going to be. Once the moderator has completed their moderation, they'll give an initial moderator feedback report. So this is sent by email to the exams office and the quality nominee. And then you read that draft report. Now, because art and design also gets a visit, the moderator will give you verbal feedback at the end of the day. So you'll be aware of what their decisions and their thoughts are. And so you'll be prepared for that. But then you get this draft report, and that allows you to respond to that and decide whether any marks need to be amended or not. So the draft report provides feedback on the accuracy of marking against the mark schemes, looking at the bands and the tasks and the mark ranges. If there's a significant difference between the marks that you've given and what the moderator decides, then there might need to be further action. Now, in most cases, the marks are going to be more or less right, more or less within tolerance, so that's not really a problem. The sample will stand, that's absolutely fine. But if there's a real issue, like the rank order of learners is going to be changed because one learner's assessment is way off beam, or if there's significant difference in terms of the application of the mark grid, then the moderator might request further samples or an extra meeting. So they'll tell you at the end of the day whether that's going to be an issue or whether it's going to be required, and you'll negotiate what that action needs to be and arrange for that to take place. But remember, because moderation is based on a sample, they don't look at the whole cohort. So the feedback is only going to be general terms in terms of the mark bands, the general harshness or generosity or accuracy of assessment. They can't look at individual learner work or respond to specific marks, because any changes that need to be made will have to be applied to the whole cohort, because the moderator is basing that on a sample of the cohort. So when you input marks, remember the sample is then randomly selected by Pearson. They will confirm what the sample will be so that you can then prepare the work ready for the visit. If it doesn't have the highest or lowest learner marks in the sample when it comes to you, just make sure that they're also available and confirmed. It should happen automatically, but if it doesn't, just make sure they're there. And many of your colleagues on other subjects, they might be doing written papers or simple, shorter exams. So they might be submitting their work via the learner work transfer system. So they'll be uploading digital evidence. For art and design, we've agreed that because of the nature of much of the evidence, it's actually more practical for the moderator to come to you. So the moderator will visit you and will spend a day looking at the sample and coming up with their judgments. However, if you have produced entirely digital submissions, so all of your learners' work is available in an easily accessible digital format, then you might want to negotiate with the moderator that you actually do send it via the learner work transfer system because it's easier for you. So you have that option if you wish. Otherwise, for art and design, the moderator will visit. If the moderator does require an extra sample, then they might request you to actually submit that digitally, but that'll be part of the discussion. When the moderator gives you feedback, and remember you'll get a draft feedback report, if there are any discrepancies, you'll have the opportunity to amend your initial marks if you wish to, using Edexcel Online. So if the moderator looks at your work and says, actually, overall, when I've looked at the sample, I think you're marking a little harshly, and in fact, I think everything could go up a couple of marks, then you have that opportunity to address that and amend the marks. So you remark the work and submit new amended marks. Conversely, if the moderator thinks that you're assessing too generously and says, well, actually, I think you're probably 2 or 3 marks over what we're looking at, they might recommend that you lower your marks. And again, you have that opportunity to do that following the draft moderator report. So remember, it needs to be all of the learner marks amended as one, not just those who were sampled by the moderator. You can't be disadvantaging or advantaging individual learners just because they happen to be sampled. It needs to be applied consistently across the cohort. So you don't have to make mark adjustments. It's not mandatory, but if the moderator suggests it, then it's probably a good idea. It's a service available it allows you to act on the feedback immediately rather than worrying about what you're going to do next time. So it allows you to make those amendments, and then once those amendments are made, there is a deadline for that. Once that deadline is met, then the marks are locked in and no further amendments can be made because the moderation process has to continue, and we have to have like a draw a line when you say, right, okay, you can't change the marks anymore. It's definitely final mark time. And what happens there is the moderator will then look again at the marks you gave, check it against their draft report and see whether it confers with their decisions, and will finalize a moderator feedback report. So this will be the final moderator feedback report based on the actual grades that you are genuinely submitting for certification. And this will be published on results day. So you'll be able to see that after the fact. Now, in terms of the sample size, from this year, we're looking at a sample size of 15 samples. So if you have a cohort of learners that are anything from 1 to 15, then it'll be all the learners. If you have a cohort that's 15 up to 100, then you can expect the sample to be 15 learners selected. If you have particularly large numbers and it's over 100, then that sample size will grow exponentially on a sliding scale. So it will explain you'll go up to 20 samples and then up to 25 samples if you have over 200 learners. So as an indication, you can generally expect, unless you've got unusually large numbers, 15 samples selected, and that will form the judgment basis for your moderator. Okay, now we'll look at quality assurance. So because we delegate authority to you to make decisions on internally assessed components, then clearly there needs to be some kind of quality assurance to make sure that those assessments are accurate. The main way we do that is through moderation, but it actually reduces the amount of administration and quality assurance you need to do under the new model. So there are certain things that you used to have to do under the previous qualifications that are no longer required. So you don't have to devise your own assignment briefs. You don't have to therefore internally verify assignment briefs because Pearson are setting those themselves. Moderation replaces what used to be standards verification for internally assessed units and components. This is much reduced in admin. The moderator takes on a lot more of that burden. And the reports are updated annually. You no longer have to have a lead internal verifier registered. You don't need to use the Oscar platform as you may have done with previous qualifications. So hopefully this gives you much more time to spend on the actual teaching and the fun stuff and getting learners engaged with the subject and getting them prepared for the assessments. There's guidance and forms that are updated annually, and you can see there's a link there. There's a quality assurance homepage, which takes you through what remaining quality assurance there is and how it manages and how it works for Tech Awards. Okay, that was component one. That was the internally assessed component. Now let's look at external assessment. So as we said, component two is externally assessed. What this means is that it's marked by Pearson. Now the end assessment rules from the regulator state that this needs to be the terminal assessment. So effectively, this is sat at the end of the qualification. There's very good reasons for that. Partly it's because this is where the learners are fully prepared and as good as they're going to be because they've had 18 months of training and delivery and teaching on this program. And it's an overview of the component. It's an overview of the qualification. It's synoptic in its nature, so it's bringing together all of the skills and knowledge and understanding that learners have developed on the program and bringing it to bear in response to a brief. So that's why it meets the requirements for a terminal assessment rule. You'll notice that it was 40% of the overall mark. So it's not the majority of the actual marks that go towards the qualification grade. And we'll look at the format of the assessment and how that works as well. What you'll see is it's actually very similar to component one. So for creative subjects, again, we have one series a year, and this is in May. So the paper is released in January each year with a submission date of May. So you've got quite a long window of opportunity to timetable the actual assessment itself. It follows 20 hours, very much like component one. So you've got quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how and when you actually sit the assessment. But what it does mean is that you can timetable this within normal sessions and give yourself plenty of time to actually get it done. But remember, in this case, you don't have to factor in time to mark the work because you're not going to mark it. It gets sent off by the centre to the external examiners. Just a note there, other subjects might have a January series as well, just because of the nature of the 20-hour practical task, art and design, we just have the one a year. And we use tasks and mark grids. So again, it's not a paper that needs to be sat like an exam. It's a task-based practical project. There is some written elements, but it's quite minimal. And it's in the context of the wider practical project. It's not strictly exam conditions, but it's higher and medium control. So it is supervised and it is invigilated by a member of staff. And again, this is really just to make sure that work is authentic and independent and learners aren't bringing in external influences or factors that aren't part of the actual assessment. Similarly, with component one, there's no minimum grade outcome to require to gain the qualification. If they get a U, that's considered an outcome. Obviously, as we've said before, absenteeism doesn't count as an outcome. They've actually got to have been present and actually submitted something. But even if it's a U, if they get a U for one component, provided they got enough points to get a decent grade on the other component, they could still end up with the qualification. So in terms of the availability, we release the internally assessed components in September of each academic year. And the idea is that learners would sit that during that autumn term. So the reason for that is that you can get it done and dusted and it's out of the way before you start on component two. So you have that, it's very flexible, but it gives you an indication of that would be a sensible way of doing it. That means then it sits there for a while because the moderation window isn't until May. So plenty of time to get it marked and any resubmissions and submitting the final marks. And the deadline for submitting final marks to the moderator, once that window opens, is 48 hours before the moderation visit. So you'll have negotiated a date for the moderator to visit. They need at least 2 days notice for the final marks to be submitted so that the sample can be selected and everybody can have the instructions of which learners need to be looked at. Obviously, the sooner you do that, the more notice you get on what the sample will be and gives you more preparation time to get ready for the moderation visit. Component 2, the externally assessed component, that's released in mid-January, so we haven't had this year's paper yet. It will be coming out in the new year. And the expectation there is that you've got that window from January to May to deliver that assessment. Now, remember, it's 20 hours, so that is quite flexible. And obviously, we need to consider half terms and Easter holidays and things like that. So working out when is going to be suitable for you to sit that. And the submission deadline for external assessment is in May. Specific dates are published on the key date schedule, which is a separate document which we'll refer to later. And in both cases, once the marks are all in, the moderation's taken place, the examination's taken place, all of the awarding process takes place and is conducted. And then in August, you'll get the results of not only each component, but the overall qualification grade as well. So in terms of delivery of this, you have a number of ways of doing this. So you could look at year 1 and year 2. So this is a very common way of looking at it. Year 1 and year 2, we're looking at component 1 and 2 just being delivered, just teaching it. So I think it's probably quite useful for learners to spend year 1 just getting used to the subject, learning and developing their understanding and developing their skills, trying their hands out at a range of evidence, working on lots of different approaches, and then not worrying about actual formal assessment that goes towards the qualification grade. And this is certainly the model that many centres have done. As I said, if you wanted to, you could deliver, could assess component 1 in the first year, but you've got to bear in mind that the majority of centres are doing that in the first term. So it wouldn't be very fair on a learner if they've just started the course to actually go and sit component 1 straight away. So in most cases, the sensible option is to do the actual formal assessment in the second year. So they could do component 1 between September and December, and you do the internal marking, and that helps prepare them for component 2, because the feedback and the assessment you give on component 1 can identify areas where a learner could possibly improve for component 2 in the external assessment. So again, quite useful way of looking at it. So what we'll do now is we'll actually look at an external paper for component 2. So this is last year's. As I said, the new one isn't come out yet. So this is the June 2025. All of these are freely available on the website. I downloaded this myself from the website, so it's available to the public. And you'll see that it does follow a very similar format to component 1, which is great because it means the learners can be more prepared and developed. It's a similar kind of length, it's 20 hours. The difference is the nature of the supervision is slightly tighter, and there is a slightly more formal element in terms of the proposal. So because of the nature of the supervision, there's actually some guidance on how to supervise and the level of invigilation required. So there's an instructions to teachers and tutors and invigilators to start with as well. Obviously, you wouldn't give these pages to the learner, but it just clarifies to you exactly how this works. So the key thing that you'll see for this paper is that actually before they get started with the first activity, there is preparation time. So before we actually start with the invigilated, the supervised elements, it's recommended that learners spend some time preparing. So you can talk about the different briefs available, think about ideas, get them starting to think about the theme and the context, and working up a kind of plan of action of how they're going to approach this. So it's really useful to actually spend some time in an informal context, just in class, talking about what kind of ideas they could come up with, reiterating the requirements and making sure that they understand that they've got to come up with a personal, individual response, but also starting to think about what decisions they might take in terms of how to respond to the brief. Then activity one is developing the project. So a minimum of 8 hours of medium control assessment. So by medium control assessment, we just mean in class with you watching. Supervision, normal. It's not exam conditions. They don't need to talk. They don't need to put their hands up if they want to talk. They must be working independently though. So they're informally supervised. It can be spread across more than one session. And this is about exploring ideas, developing um, responses, initial ideas, playing with materials, techniques, and processes, thinking about further experimentation, reviewing their progress, and recording their development, saving it for activity four. So again, at every stage in every activity, they should be recording what they do as they go along, because that will form part of the submission. What they can't do at this stage is start writing their development review. And I'll explain what that is because that's activity two. They can't be working on their final response, and they can't be making pages for the portfolio. So really, it's just stressing that at this stage, they're still just batting around some ideas, doing some experimentation, thinking about where they're going to go. They don't want to be starting too early on the other activities, because the other activities have got their own set amount of time, and you want to use the full amount of time for each activity. Some more information on what can be done in this stage, and you can support explaining what informal supervision means, so you can help them with safety, workspace. You're facilitating, but you can't be giving the learners ideas. You can't be telling them what they need to do or making suggestions on the quality of their work. They have to do all of that themselves. They're making the decisions. What you're doing there is facilitating it. And the other thing is at the end of these sessions, anything they have produced needs to be taken away and kept securely and archived, because they will need to refer to those at various points, but they can't be adding to it outside of the sessions. So the timing on this one is tighter and is a bit more formal than component one. Activity two is the bit that's slightly different. There's an hour and 30 minutes of formal supervision. So what they do is they're given a review template. So it's a PDF with 3 text boxes, and they need to respond to 3 questions, and they've got half an hour-ish on each question. The key thing is that there's nothing in those questions that they shouldn't already know, because effectively what they're doing is putting together a proposal for what they're going to produce. So they need to complete this independently. They can't have access to the internet at this point. They're not doing any more research. They're simply writing up what their development was like and reviewing that and coming up with a plan for how they're going to proceed and how it meets the brief. And this needs to be stored as a PDF securely and kept clearly labeled, because this is a document that will be submitted for assessment. Learners can refer back to it when they're producing the final activities 3 and 4, but of course it needs to be a locked copy. So maybe you print it out, maybe you give them an uneditable PDF copy of it. So once they've done that initial research and the development review, then they're working on the final response. So they've got 8 hours under supervised conditions to produce the final response. What they're thinking about here is how to develop their response in terms of the specific brief that they chose. Again, they need to record every stage of this, because all of this is going to be useful when it comes to the final activity of putting the portfolio together. They need to know what they've done, particularly if they're working digitally. Keep screenshots of things in various different stages of completion. Make sure that they've got a full record of how they got there from start to finish. And that's really, really crucial, that they must show that really good development of the final response. It's not enough to just have the finished piece. Again, it can happen over multiple sessions. They need to put work away in between sessions. They can refer back to their development work and they can see that. But again, it's about you facilitating their completion and helping them with the space and helping them with the resources, not helping them to make decisions or plan for them how they're going to do this. And then finally, activity 4 is building a portfolio. So they've got 2.5 hours of formal supervision where they're going to put together the work that they've produced in a digital portfolio, including annotation, and they save this as a PDF. So there's a key thing here that these are skills that you will have need to have taught the learners before they come into the assessment. They need to know how to put together a digital portfolio. Now, this could be as simple as taking photographs of work and sticking it all together and into a Word document or a PowerPoint or a Spark presentation. Or it could be that they're actually collating and producing a digital presentation within a template or within a design of their own making. Key thing is that before they even start this assessment, they should be competent in doing that. So that's a skill that needs to be taught during the teaching of component 2, how to put together a portfolio. Now, we make no apology for this because this is actually a key skill that all creatives are going to need in their careers. It's a key skill that most learners have already kind of got to a certain extent, but it's really important that they've given access to facilities so that they can do that. They're given practice on how to photograph physical work and how to prepare and manipulate and edit images, and how to put together a presentation and how to lay out text and images in a coherent way. So these are all really good skills to be taught in component 2, which will feed into this activity 4. So they've only got the materials they produced in the previous activities, and they need to complete it independently, and they're putting together this 6 to 8 pages of a digital portfolio laid out however they like, however they want. But remember that this PDF document is going to be sent to the examiner. So the 3 pieces of evidence that are submitted are the portfolio, which combines activities 1 and 3 and 4. So putting together the portfolio, all the practical work. You've got the separate document, which is their activity 2, the development review, and also an authentication sheet. So they've completed an authentication sheet declaring that the work is authentic and individually their own. And in this case, you can see there's a specific submission deadline, 15th of May. This was last year. So you can expect the deadline to be somewhere in mid-May. Okay, so the first part of that document is instructions to you. Basically, what then happens is it repeats those instructions, but this is for the learners. So when you hand it out to the learners, you'll give them page 6 onwards. And it really just goes into how to do it, very simpler, but in slightly simpler terms. And obviously, it doesn't talk in as much detail about the level of supervision and invigilation. Okay, so now we come on to the brief. And as I said, as with component 1, the activities and the format and the layout and the skills being assessed have been the same every year. The only thing that changes is the actual brief. And again, it's usually, as is the case here, a relatively broad theme with a client that's asking for a particular range of outcomes, and then a series of briefs that a learner can respond to, which will help reflect any specialist discipline that that learner happens to be doing. So what we've got here is animals is the theme, art for animals, organized exhibition displaying art and design work inspired by animals, and a range of products which are sold to raise funds. They're targeting an audience of people aged 14 to 18, and you're being asked to produce a portfolio of work and development review. So they need to be appropriate for the audience, needs to celebrate the theme of animals and show a positive relationship, a positive message about our relationship with animals. So that's the brief. Now, the learners are then able to choose any one of these to follow up. So this is in that preparation time when you're thinking before they've started activity 1. This is the kind of thing that you can discuss and talk to the learners and say, well, what do you think is feasible? What works to your strengths, what follows the discipline that we do on this course or that you're particularly following. So you can see there's decorative or wearable accessory. So you're talking about jewelry or product design or fashion. A web page, so digital design. Poster or banner, so graphic design. Textiles product for clothing, display or promotional. So you've both got constructed printed textiles or fashion there. 2D or 3D art or design exhibition work, so you've got more fine art angle. A design for decorative furniture or household item, so interior design or product design. A brand identity or logo and packaging, so again we're back to graphics, illustration, or a range of illustrations for use in a book. So hopefully there's enough diversity in terms of the range there that any learner will find something that will match their interests and they'll be able to choose that. And the key thing to remember is that the learner should choose which one they do. Now, in some cases, it might be pretty obvious because they're already on a course that primarily does fashion, for example. But it's important that the learners have that choice because part of their discussion and part of their evidence is that they will justify that choice and justify that decision. Now you've got some images just to inspire them. So just a few images, just to, so they're not staring at a blank page, thinking about how they can develop their work. And then it explains the set tasks very clearly. So this is simple bullet by bullet instructions. This is the task you need to do. This is the time you've got to do it. This is how many marks it makes up. When you get to activity 2, you'll see that you then have this document. So you've got the 3 questions here, and this learners are presented with an editable PDF. So it's a text box that they can click into and fill this bit out. So this is the bit that needs to be done in formal supervision, that you need an hour and a half where they sit down, having already started and coming up with ideas and got a plan. All you're asking them here is, first of all, to describe their ideas for the final response, then explain how their ideas have been supported by the research and exploration. So what research have they done and how does it feed into it? And thirdly, how will your final response meet the requirements of the brief? So how will they actually answer the brief with what they're planning to do? So justify your ideas. So it's, what are you going to do? How have you researched it and how far have you got with this and how's it informed your ideas? And why does it meet the brief? So there's nothing there that the learner shouldn't already know. And again, because this is quite formal, this is an area that you might want to spend time practicing with your learners on previous projects. So it's not a bad idea in the teaching and learning, even with formative assessments, even the one, you're just going through the skills and explaining the creative process, to always ask learners these 3 questions. And in the mocks and in the practice runs, in formative activities, get them to be used to the practice of developing a development review and thinking about these 3 questions, thinking about how they can answer them. So when they come to do the real one, the external assessment in their final year, they've done this before. They've had a few practice runs at it. They know what's expected. They know how to do it. And so they're a lot more comfortable with the idea. So it's really useful if you prepare your learners and so that they understand why you're asking this and what they need to do. Because in this case, they'll have an hour and a half to do it and it's formal supervision so that they're on their own. It's worth noting at this point that any learners who've got special requirements, anything that's listed on the JCQ special requirements, that this always applies. So if they need extra time, if they need a scribe, if they need particular resources, then this complies with all of those things. So if you've got learners that you're concerned about who might need extra time because they're statemented condition, then that's absolutely fine. And then it goes on to explain the final response activity and the producer portfolio activity and explains how they need to lay it out and what needs to be done. So there's plenty of time to talk through this with the learners and explain what they need to do. What I'm going to do very quickly then is we'll look at sample mark learner work. So just as we have with component 1, we have a whole bank of materials for learner work who've sat past papers with the marks that they received and the examiner's justification of those marks. So I'll spend a little bit of time just looking at the sample mark learner work. Now, this is a learner who achieved a high mark. And again, we've got a range of high, medium, and low responses. But I'll just very briefly go through this. So this was for the 2023 paper, and the theme was Make Music Day. So you can see here, very similar layout. They've got a theme, clients, an instruction, and then you've got a series of briefs to respond to, some imagery, and then they go through the set task. So exactly the same as we've seen in the most recent paper. So here's the learner work. So what we've got here is some enlarged text in where it's too small to read, but basically they produced a development process and working it towards a garment. So they produced a jacket, and it's an appropriate response to the brief because it's all about music. The development review is very well written and a clear explanation of the learner's intentions. It's a strong body of work, and they got 53 marks. This is a really good piece of work, and we're very pleased with the quality and the response to it. So this is kind of a putting together all the research, but you'll see how it's emboldened here and made larger. So you've got a mind map, you've got a discussion of target audience. So they've decided to go with like here's an example target audience person. So she's a 16-year-old guitarist. So they're thinking very, very focused on who the customer, who the audience might be. Some designer inspiration. So looking at Chitra Subiakto, who's an Indonesian designer, and using batik particularly and traditional techniques. Alice Archer, also a British designer, and she's looking at embroidery in particular like that. So thinking about embellishments and different details. The client research, they're looking into Make Music Day, which is a real thing. And so explaining where that's come from, showing that they've actually thought about how they can build it into the context of what is already a very well-established event. Further research, looking at mind map. Melody Hisaki is a New York-based artist, and she's more of a visual artist, but she also uses music and fashion together. So how do you bring these things together? Okay, the next sheet. So you can see how this has been put together in large-scale pictures, and obviously it's got to be high enough definition that the examiner can zoom in and read everything. But in this case, we've enlarged it for the purposes of this document. So you've got an artist response, trying out batik, and then looking at embroidery and machine embroidery in response to Alice Archer, looking at designs. And so what you saw, I'll just skip back on the main sheet. You can see that they did batik there, and they're looking at embroidery, embellishments and things. So this is how they responded. Looking at designs for the jacket, once they decided what to do, you can see that the annotations are really telling that story. They're really taking you through step by step what they do. Mostly descriptive, but there is a focus on not just describing what they did, but how each stage informs and feeds into the other, and how it helped. So it's quite good in that case. It's not maybe critical analysis as such, but you wouldn't expect that at this level. But what they are doing is doing a bit more than just describing what they did. There's a lot of explanation there. There's a sheet on the making, so explaining how they've done it, what the stages were, and then the product. So looking at the actual jacket itself, how it was put together. So, considering the time they'd got and considering the level we're at, it's a pretty good piece of work. They actually did manage to finish a constructed garment. Not only that, but it's got embroidery and painted and batik embellishments on it. So quite a lot of work went into that, which is pretty good to see. Also, you've got photographs on a mannequin, front, back, and side. So you're really getting a sense of the piece. So again, thought gone into how to present this actual piece of work. It's not just a single image. And furthermore, they then go into details because they recognize that actually There's quite a few details in this that you really need to get a close-up to. So they've taken some close-up photographs. And again, on the document, you'll be able to see it better than you can in this event. But it explains how each technique was used in the jacket. And some evaluation there. So again, quite brief, but sort of explanatory annotations. So the development review, you can see in this case, this is quite an academically able student for the level. So they've started to think about what they're going to do, and they'd clearly got a very good idea once they got going. So they've explained they're going to make a jacket, practical clothing. They're thinking about dimensions because they've thought about their audience. Um, what plans, what materials they're going to use, what techniques like batik, explaining why they're going to use calico because it works well with batik, um, thinking about what other aspects they can put. There's acrylic painting on the jacket as well. So they've got a very clear idea once they've done that research, but they'd explain how that research worked into that idea and how they put it all together and what the fact that they're looking at kind of 70s classic rock. So they actually researched 70s genre and fashion and figured that a denim jacket was quite appealing. And then the response to the needs of the client. So thinking about the festival, thinking about what would be suitable in that environment, thinking again about the research, their audience, looking at product and imagery and message. So this is a very well constructed development review. So generally speaking, the learner here is achieving that mark band 4. Now, what we'll use this for as well is an example of the marking grid for component 2. So it's very similar, although it's not strictly on the 12 marks per grid that we have with component 1. It's a little bit more flexible, but remember, you're not marking this as an assessor. You're teaching to it. The examiner will use this mark grid as a way of making decisions. You get to see the mark grid, which is great because it means that you can still think about what is being looked for, but it's a very similar process. So in this case, there's an effective development, confident use of research, practical exploration. I think we can all agree it's pretty good. It's the bottom of that mark band. So it's 15. There was areas that it could go better, but what we're looking here is that this particular portfolio provides a good example of how research could be presented. They put it all on a big sheet, but then had a close up so you can see it. You can see how the initial research has been refined. You can see how they've explored a good range of ideas before selecting a pathway. So by the time they got to the product, the development review, they'd got a very strong idea, but you can see how it came from the initial research that they did. So assessment objective 2, which is development review. In this particular case, when you're looking at the intentions for the final response, you're looking at activity 2 in particular, this is as good as we can expect from a learner at this level. I don't think there's very much to criticize really, because remember we are looking at the toppermost marks. We're still looking at level 2, so it's for that level. It's a very detailed description. It's been effectively informed by appropriate research. There's really good consideration of the client and the audience. They never lost sight of who it was for and why they were doing it. The level of detail is impressive considering they had 90 minutes to to write it. So again, in this particular case, very good. In some of the other sample mark learner work, you will see other responses that aren't quite so strong. And again, it's useful to look at all of the ranges to get an idea of what we're expecting to see from learners. The key thing is that learners have the opportunity in that development review to communicate further information in support of their practical work. So it provides the opportunity to describe technical processes that might not be immediately apparent from the portfolio. And so what, for example, the learner here talked about using Calico because it applies to batik better. So they're demonstrating understanding and knowledge that they don't necessarily have in the photographs immediately apparent. So 16 here. So again, they did very well. Final response absolutely meets the requirements. There's no problem with that. It was very clear. There's confident use of appropriate practical art and design skills. I mean, they produced a complete garment that fitted the mannequin that looked pretty good in terms of dimensions and in terms of stitching and embroidery. I mean, it might have been nice if they could have showed the actual seams and the stitching and the layouts. They might have benefited from showing the patterns that they cut in initial stages, but even so, it's still pretty strong. So we're talking about 16 out of 18 here. Well, here's a tip, when learners choose ambitious outcomes such as this, they should be encouraged to document their creative process thoroughly. So photograph stages of the manufacture of the product or outcome. That's kind of what was missing from this, that you got the finished article and you got some of the initial experimentations, but what you didn't get was the construction stages of the garment step by step. You had some close-ups of them working on a machine, but you didn't actually see the toil, the patterns, the layout, this construction, the step-by-step activity. And they could have maybe picked up a couple of extra marks there. And 10 out of 12 here. So again, very well put together portfolio. Couple of bits missing, maybe some additional selection and editing to present the work more effectively. But again, for level 2, not bad at all. We're quite pleased with it. And it was appropriate to the client and brief. It was the style and design was considered. The presentation was considered. There was a consistent aesthetic throughout the presentation. So they had thought at that extra level, if you like. But a real big tip here, if they're producing 3D products, remember effective photography is really helpful. So getting learners to understand how to make good photographs, thinking about details, close-ups, or ways in which they can demonstrate scale is really important. Okay, hopefully that was useful. We'll just go back to the slides again. As I say, I don't want to spend too much time on these materials simply because you can look at these in your own time, and there's many more available on the website. So please use the links and use the specification page to build up that portfolio, that library of material that you can use to help develop. So in terms of grading, just to reiterate, learners must sit and achieve an outcome for all components, but a U is classified as an outcome. The raw marks are awarded for each component. So those are the marks that you give as an assessor based on the mark grid and the marks that we've just seen on that sample mark learner work there. What happens is that there's awarding meetings with the principal examiners, principal moderators, once all of the marks are in for a series, and those raw marks are converted to something called uniform mark scheme points. And these are what are used to develop the grade boundaries and agree the grade boundaries for that series. So it's really important to note that 34 marks in one year might give you this grade, but 34 raw marks the next year may end up with a different grade because the grade boundaries are flexible and they will be changed based on the awarding of the assessment each time. So it's really important to note that that could be something that changes. What doesn't change is the raw marks that you give. And for a component, you get 6 grade scale. So the grade boundaries are set at level 2 distinction at the highest, through level 2 merit, level 2 pass, level 1 distinction, level 1 merit, level 1 pass. So those are the 6 bands that are grades for a component. When it gets to the overall qualification, there's an extra grade. So on top of the level 2 distinction, there's actually a level 2 distinction star. So there's an extra grade that they can get. And this is based on whether a learner gets distinctions for both components at level 2, but their overall point score is so high that they can actually get into the grade band for level 2 distinction star overall as well. So there's a small percentage of learners might make it to there. So the final grade is an aggregation of the marks for each component. So whatever marks have been given, as you said, 60% goes for component 2, 40% for sorry, 60% for component 1, 40% for component 2. So the weighting is there, and that will then aggregate and make up an overall qualification grade. And a higher performance in one component can balance out a lower outcome in the others. So again, there's some flexibility there, some safety net there in terms of a learner who may not have fully performed in one component. They can make up for it with a better performance in another component. So in terms of support, there's lots of complementary training resources and to help you deliver the new assessments and apply the mark scheme. So as well as the specification, which tells you everything you need to know effectively, you've got a teacher delivery guide. You've got sample assessment materials, as we've seen, so they're old papers and example papers. You also have Exam Wizard and Results Plus, so if they're written exams, they're there for other tech awards. Marking training, so there is standardization events and training on how to mark qualifications, how to mark the components and use the mark grids. This Pearson Subject Specialist, you have the subject's advisor, Jacqueline Veed, and she's and her team are very approachable and very responsive to any questions you might have. So that gives you everything you could possibly need to run the qualification. There are also some paid resources on top of that if you felt like paying a bit extra and getting extra materials, and there's active learn teacher packs and things like that. Most of the available resources are freely available in the public domain on the specification webpage. So you've got the Pearson Set Assignments. Like I say, once they're out there and they stay on the website and they're freely available. You can use them as practice runs, mocks, or just preparation for learners. Make sure you enter the learners for the internal assessments and the external assessments in the series that they're going to be sat. There's a frequently asked questions page available to refer to whenever you need support. And again, that's based on the questions that Jacqueline and her team have had over the year. And so we build up a bank of frequently asked questions. So you probably will find any answers to questions on that page. There's also on-demand training, so you can get bite-sized playlists and on-demand training through the Resource Hub. There's a series of live events. So this is a recording, but we do this event live. And the benefit of doing it live is that you get to network with other colleagues in different centres. You also get to ask questions directly and follow the training at your own pace. And we can have more detailed discussions, which is very useful. And there's a series of ones looking specifically at external assessment, specifically at internal assessment and the moderation process. So it's well worth looking out for any new events coming up. And all the course materials are on the specification page. So what the best thing to do is go to Pearson Qualification website. And what I tend to do is if you go to the subjects at the top, the subject menu, just pick art, design and media. And once you get to that page, on the right-hand side, there's a long menu with all of the qualification sizes, levels. Click on that and within 2 clicks, you'll get to the Tech Awards in Art and Design Practice. And then you have the specification, and you can see in that screenshot there, you've got course materials. On the course materials tab, you've got all of the stuff that we've looked at today and more, and all of the things that we've referred to and discussed, all freely available to you. It just remains for me to say thank you. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this recording useful, and good luck in the future. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.